Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Quintera Souffrant, and I am the Curator of Community Dialogue here at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And welcome to tonight's expert series, the Ashcan School, Honoring Complex Representations. Tonight's program is part of the exhibition programming for the Ashcan School and the 8, Creating a National Art. And I want to thank our generous exhibition sponsors who are featured on this slide. And I also want to offer additional thanks to the Latent Art Collection for sponsoring tonight's program. The Latent Art Collection was formed by English-American philanthropist Frederick Leighton beginning in 1888, and represents the first public art collection of the city of Milwaukee. And the majority of the collection has been on view at the Milwaukee Art Museum since the mid-20th century. So thank you, and thank you to the members of the Latent Art Society who are here tonight. In addition to tonight's program, please join us for the gallery talk on Thursday, November 10th at 12 p.m. It is a great opportunity to revisit the exhibition with some of my brilliant MAM colleagues. By that, I mean China Bounds, Assistant Curator. Raise your hand, China. And it's really a magical experience going through that with China if you haven't seen it already. Before we begin, may I ask you to please silence your cell phones if you haven't already. I will give you some time to do that. And so MAM's Expert Series brings together local, national, and internationally renowned figures for informal conversations around works of art that allow us to dive deeper into particular themes, all from the perspective of multiple expert voices. And our panelists this evening will all explore the theme of honoring complex representations as it relates to the Ashcan School and the 8. And our guests include Dr. Ann Basting, writer, artist, and advocate for the power of creativity to transform aging care. She is professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and founder of the award-winning nonprofit TimeSlips, which trains, inspires, and supports caregivers to infuse creativity into care. Her writing and large-scale public performances have helped shape an international movement to extend creative and meaningful expression from childhood, where it is expected, through to late life, where it has long been withheld. Her books include Creative Care, a revolutionary approach to elder and dementia care, Penelope, an arts-based odyssey to transform elder care, and Forget Memory, creating better lives for people with dementia. Anne is the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, informally known as the Genius Grant, and numerous major awards and grants. She believes that creative engagement can and should be infused into every aging care system and has trained or consulted with Meals on Wheels, libraries, senior centers, museums, adult day programs, and every level of long-term care. Thanks for being here, Anne. Dr. Nikki Otten is the Associate Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Milwaukee Art Museum, where she's responsible for a collection of works on paper spanning from 15th century to the present. And since arriving at the museum in 2018, she's curated the major exhibitions Always New, The Posters of Jules Charest, and Landfall Press, 5 Decades of Printmaking. She's also organized several rotations drawn from the museum's collection. Previously, Nikki held fellowships and internships at the Weissman Art Museum at the University of Minnesota, the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, and the Minneapolis Institute of Art. She holds a PhD in art history from the University of Minnesota, where she completed a dissertation that examines how the telescope and microscope influenced symbolist artistic vision in the 19th century. Thanks, Nikki. And Miss Debra Yepa-Pappan is a Chicago-based Korean and Hamas Pueblo artist who utilizes digital imagery to share her story about being mixed-race. Her earlier works consisted of traditional black and white photography and examined issues of Native American stereotypes. This path led Debra to focus more on her own identity, and as a result, her pride in both her cultures are conveyed in her art. She points out the similarities within her two cultures by incorporating symbolic imagery found in both, while keeping a contemporary and pop art aesthetic. Debra was educated at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe and Columbia College, Chicago. She has exhibited nationally and internationally, and she is currently the Native Community Engagement Coordinator at the Field Museum in Chicago and the co-founder of the Center for Native Futures, also in Chicago. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So as part of the expert series, each of the panelists were charged with choosing one work of art for them to respond to informally. So that is how we're gonna begin, and then we've got a few other questions that they will respond to informally, and then we will try to open it up for audience questions. So Anne, let's start with you. This was your work of art, John Sloan's Mother, circa 1906. And can you tell us what drew you to this work?
She's looking at me. Honestly, I mean, it's kind of a rare thing. There's a lot to say. The bulk of representation, sort of in particularly Western representations of aging, and particularly around this time period, were really about pity and loss and tragedy. And that really kind of continues to this day. The other representations of age in the series are a little bit more representative of that approach. We have a very difficult time understanding, particularly in Western narratives, that growth is possible all the way to the end of life. And so the late life tends to get represented solely in terms of loss. In this one, first of all, I found it very interesting, and I actually looked back at the age of the artist when he made this, and he was 35, so she might be in her, like, my age, like late 50s, 60s. So, you know, as far as like what that means in terms of age today is very different to what it meant then, because at that point, the life expectancy for women was 50. And for men, it was 48 in 1906. So we're looking at a very different conception of aging, but you can get a feeling for her. There's a liveliness. It looks as though someone has just said something and she's responding, which is also not usual for representations of age at that time or even now. There's a spark inside of her, which I was really drawn to, and really loved it. Now, it's also interesting because it also feels like she's very settled in that chair. She's not going anywhere. So physically, she's set. So I don't know whether that means she can't move. She has a cane across her lap. That dog is not going anywhere. That dog is very comfortable on her lap, which is also interesting because there's a sense of sort of unconditional love in that animal that's with her. And the fan, for people who are at the age she is, people might know that you might need to cool off occasionally. And so it's a really interesting, realistic portrayal, and yet at the same time, it feels like while she's locked into that big cozy chair, there is a liveliness and an energy and like I said, a spark behind her eyes. So I think I just fell in love with that a little bit, and was a little bit longing for depictions of that combination of realism and, I think, life. So, does that answer your question?
It does, and I was drawn to a few things that you said. One is that she's alive, both literally, but also this sense of a woman of her age who's often depicted as being outside of everyday life, like can no longer engage. She is still plugged in and tuned in and sort of depicted with that sense of aliveness and spark that you mentioned. Also, I am going to plug again the tour with China. Sorry, Nikki is over here, with China, because you mentioned that this is John Sloan's mother and that some of the other works in the collection do not have that same sort of care and painting elder figures with aliveness. And I wonder how much of that has to do with the fact that that's his mother and he knows her spirit. And that might be something that China addresses on her tour. I know this because I went on the tour with her and she does address it. So please go on the tour. So interesting that you mentioned that and that you sort of tuned into that. So thank you. Nikki, I've been thinking about you because I keep calling China Nikki. So on to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the works that you chose, because you have two?
Yes, so I was asked by our former American art curator, Brandon Rood, to write an essay for the exhibition catalog about Arthur Bowen Davies. And I knew very little about Arthur Bowen Davies before I started on this project, but we have many of his works on paper in the collection. Davies is a very strange artist. He's hard to categorize. Much of the scholarship about Davies, I learned, is on that very subject, about how hard he is to characterize, categorize, and that was a through line of scholarship from Davies' lifetime forward. So if you've been up into the exhibition, all of the Davies works are at the very end, and you may have gone into that section and wondered what it was that you were looking at. In researching, I found that there was quite a lot of overlap in looking at Davies' work and my own work as a scholarly art historian. So I'm very interested in the intersection between science and art, and that's something that Davies was also looking at the time. So in this work, there you see three different figures, or three figures, and they're overlapping. And in my interpretation of this work, it's actually one figure who's executing a turn. And you can see that there are some strong diagonals throughout the composition that help to indicate the direction that the person is turning. And Davies was very interested in figuring out how to represent motion in his work. And that was something that a lot of artists at this time were thinking about, was how to capture movement and motion in these static, two-dimensional works of art. So Davies came up with something called continuous composition, and he defined that as repeating the same motif over and over again. So in this case, he's repeating the same figure to create a sense of rhythm in his work. And I learned that he was most likely influenced by a new form of motion photography. So could we look at the next slide? So there is a scientist, a physiologist named Etienne Jules-Marie, who was working in France at the end of the 19th century. And he was inspired by Edward Muybridge, who you might know a little bit better, to develop a new type of what he called chronophotography. So Muybridge and Marie both wanted to capture distinct instants of emotion so you could see them with your eye, which you couldn't always do. But Muybridge's photos were all separate. He used many different cameras that each produced an image. And Marie invented a system where his camera captured the motions on one plate. So you see that they're overlapping on the plate at the top, much like Davies's print, the figures overlapping there. The bottom one the bottom one on the other slide is interesting because at a certain point, Marie decided that that overlap was too confusing. It made it too hard to interpret the image. So he asked his photographic subjects to dress in a black suit with white stripes on their limbs. And he photographed them that way, so you only get the legs and the arms moving in that bottom image. So he's invented a much more abstract way of representing motion, and Davies is heading in that direction too in this print. So you can see he's looking at a lot of scientific imagery, and I also, in my work outside of the museum and for the museum sometimes, I like to think about the printmaking process and the printmaking matrix to see if they can add additional layers of meaning to the finished print. So in this case, they do. Davies used a process called dry point, and that involves carving into a copper plate with a sharp tool. When you do that, it raises what's called a burr of metal on either side of the groove. And then when you ink and print the groove and the burr, it creates this lovely, soft, fuzzy line. So in this case, it looks a little bit blurry, and that helps to contribute to that idea of motion traveling through this print. And Marie's photographs are also a little bit blurry, so they kind of overlap in that way. And additionally, the way that Marie thought about motion is similar to printmaking, because Marie, the physiologist, is that the word? He said that external factors in the world imprint themselves in the memory, or they etch themselves in the memory. Those are the words that he used. And so Davies is carving a representation of motion into this copper plate, much like Marie thought that external stimuli etch themselves into the mind. So that was my argument for the essay and the catalog, and it intersects with a lot of my interests as a scholar.
So Nikki, you gave me a lot to chew on, but I want to first say that I think that there is a way when you are a curator at a renowned museum, people assume that you know everything about everything, and I love that you chose a work because you knew nothing about the artist going in and that you were transparent about that, and I felt like it really modeled Anne's comment about how as you age, you grow in your learning. So one, that was a big takeaway for me in terms of your attraction to the work. Two, I love seeing you get geeked out and connect with Davies on the connection between science and art, and also the conversation across mediums that are happening. So thank you for sharing that and bringing that to the fore of the conversation. Debra, last but not least, your work. What drew you to it?
Well, before I start, I just want to say thank you again for this invitation to be a part of this panel. And also, I just want to say that I am an honored guest here on the lands of Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe peoples, and many more, I'm sure. And I know that Milwaukee also has a thriving native, urban native community too. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank them for welcoming me as a guest. So with these, you know, I'm not familiar with, and I hadn't been familiar with, you know, Ashcan and the 8. And when I was asked to look through, you know, the images and select something that resonated with me, I have to be honest, nothing did. I just, you know, it's the experiences and what, you know, what was represented in a lot of those images is not my experience. I'm Native American, I'm Asian, and, you know, even the depictions, some of the depictions of, you know, there's a painting of a Chinese woman, which I thought was, it felt to me just so stereotypical. Her skin is painted so yellow. And, you know, it wasn't something that I felt, you know, I was gravitated toward in any way. And I feel that even the depictions of, you know, non-white peoples is looking through a particular lens. It's looking, you know, almost using that anthropological lens and looking at us as others. However, when I came across these images, when I took a really close look and I saw the titles of these did stand out to me. I'm always, anytime I see Native people depicted or misrepresented, you know, in art made by non-Native people, I have to take a closer look, and I'm always very critical. So I'm Jemez Pueblo. My people are in New Mexico. My village is about 50 miles northwest of Albuquerque. And what you see in these images, these are ceremonial dances in the Pueblos. However, you see like all of these non-Native, mostly white American tourists coming into our Pueblo and watching our dances. We do have some open, you know, feast days, and those are ceremonies that, you know, the public and everybody are invited to. But I think what just really captured me in this image up here where you see all the people just kind of gathered around the plaza as the dancers are dancing. You know, to me, it really feels like it's symbolic of that Western expansion of, you know, people going out west and just, you know, taking in the novelty of, you know, our ceremonies. And, you know, but also like having this kind of disrespect and disdain for, you know, our ceremonies. This is a time for us, or, you know, these ceremonies are a time when, you know, we pray. These are blessings. These are times when we're praying for everybody, for the good, you know, health and well-being of everyone in the world. And you have these tourists that are, you know, they don't understand that. They you know, seem disrespectful. They're having their own dances off to the side. They're chattering. And so to me, it just feels, you know, like that's what I see when I see this. And also when I take a closer look at the dancers themselves, you know, at first I thought, wow, that's actually almost an accurate depiction of how, you know, we carry out our dances in our ceremonies. And I can easily identify them as Pueblo dancers. My daughter also dances when we go and visit my village. But then when I take a closer look at their faces too, you know, they're misrepresented, right? That's not how Pueblo people look. And, you know, they look very much, you know, closer to the you know, non-native crowd around them. So I think that's the disconnect, and maybe the artist not really wanting to take the time to understand and learn who we are and what we look like. And so to me, you know, that is a great misrepresentation. And I think about, when I look at the dancers and the way that they're depicted, I think about artist Pablita Velarde, who is a Santa Clara Pueblo artist, who, you know, she was a great painter in her time, in the 30s, 40s, and all the way through her life until she passed away in 2006, I believe. And she depicted so many beautiful, you know, just our lives as Pueblo people. And she did it in a way that came from her lived experience. And so there's a real difference if you look up her work and then you see that next to these. So yeah, I mean, I think I have more thoughts around this, but those initially.
You chose the second one. Do you feel like
I think they're both, yeah, I mean, they're both kind of the same. It's just, you know, the kind of disrespect, you know, it's a privilege to come and see, you know, our ceremonies, to be a part of our feast days, to, you know, to be in the plaza with us, with the people, and watching our dances, because we're dancing for you as much as we are dancing for, you know, our people. But again, it's just this, you know, not wanting to take the time to understand, and you know, they all kind of are doing their own thing, which is, you know, if that were to happen today, they may be kicked out of our village, and so it is something that is just disrespectful.
You started off by saying that when you look through the exhibition checklist, you actually weren't called to anything because it felt very much outside of your own experience and like representations of stereotypes, and that is a very real experience that can happen going through an art catalog or checklist. So I wanted to thank you for that, and also for the ways in which you've talked about the ways in which a lot of the representations of communities of color featured here. And you mentioned this with representations of the elderly. A lot of it feels like caricatures, stereotypes, not rooted in sort of respect. And I didn't notice until just now that we've got 2 Sloan works, or 3 Sloan works, and how we get to see one, this like honorific representation of someone that feels really empathic, and another one that's sort of more documentary, anthropological lens, as you were talking about, sense of the other and the distance, which I think leads into our first formal question for conversation. So I'm gonna read it because there's a lot of context and I wanna get it right. The Ashcan School received some praise when they were first exhibited, but at the same time, their work, for lack of a better term, was trashed when they emerged onto the art scene, hence the term Ashcan. Their subjects were everyday people and street scenes that were considered too radical for museum walls at the time. However, both then and now, there are debates about whether or not the artists of the Ashcan School were truly radical in their representation of everyday people, immigrants, low-income people, people of color, or if they were more reactionary, so documenting the newest, hottest thing during the time period they were living in. And I wonder if each of you could answer in your own words what you think it means to be a radical artist, and how do or can radical artists push representations to make them more complex? I'll give it a beat. And then, Debra, I might start with you since you ended us, and we can go this way. And you can come back, you can add to it.
Yeah, I think, what is radical, or what is the idea of radical? I mean, I think it is a matter of perspective also. I mean, because anything could be radical. So I work at the Field Museum, where we just renovated our Native American Hall. That and decolonization, of museums could be considered radical, right? But these are movements that are necessary. They help to push the envelope. They help to push things toward change, because if you try to change things, people are always resistant. So I think sometimes you have to use certain means to try to change thoughts and ways of doing. I think I probably have more thoughts around that, but that's what we're.
I wonder, and I would love to hear what you think about this, if radicalness has to do with speed of change, because sometimes I feel like I'm committed to this long haul change that doesn't get recognized necessarily as radical, because I'm committed to the dialogue around it. Because, like you said, you can make a choice. And sometimes I think the perception of radical art is that it's like, boom, in your face, change now, immediate. It's totally reactionary to a moment or what's happening in the moment. But then there's a radicalness that might have a different time frame and is committed to a different kind, but it's the same, it's committed to the same social change. It's just a different time frame and process. So I think both are radical, but one gets called radical more than the other. I don't know. Just a thought.
Did you want to respond to that, Debra? Since it was a question about whether or not radical has to do with time and speed. And I am not an Ashcan expert, so I'm gonna look to China. But it does feel like a lot of why they were perceived as radical is because it was too much, too soon, people weren't ready, there wasn't a slow build up. And I think that your example about decolonizing museums is a really great example of how, yeah, this is sort of seen as happening too soon, but also how long have we been living in institutions where we've been okay with the status quo of documenting the other, silencing the other, like refusing space for the other to speak. And so even though it is sort of an immediate demand, it's responding to a long haul and long tradition. So I just...
Yeah, I think, I feel like when it is something that takes a long time, you can adapt, right? You can adjust, and then it doesn't feel, like there isn't that feeling of that it's radical. And I think when things are slower to change, sometimes they end up not changing. because then you just kind of get comfortable in where you're at. And then you're like, oh, well, yeah, no, things are okay. And you kind of forget why you started to make that change in the first place. Because, in some ways, just from my personal experience now in the museum, it felt like we were doing this really radical thing in, wow, we're talking to Native people and they're actually at the table, telling their stories and we're giving them their voice. That's great and that's beautiful and that's what we should be doing. But now I feel like the institution feels like, oh, yeah, okay, we've done that now. All right. There's still so much more work that needs to be done, but we're not doing it now because now we're in this comfortable phase because we've done this part. So I feel like they need to be kicked in the butt. So there has to be a radical kind of like shaking up or just shaking them and doing something that's a little more in your face.
So radical is in your face. It is very much of this moment. It is an expedited process, but could also have sort of this long range reach, like you were mentioning, and in terms of dialogue and commitment to sort of sustain change and movement over time. Nikki, I wanted to know whether or not you wanted to add to the conversation.
Yes, I was interested in what you said about radicalism being linked to the speed at which it's happening, because I do think that was part of why the Ashcan school artists were considered radical, because the idea that everyday people should be represented in art was relatively new at the time, and there were a lot of everyday people being represented all at once in a style that people weren't familiar with. But to your point, it didn't go as far as it could have in terms of radicalizing who is making the art. So it's representations of other people by kind of the same white male artists. So it's radical in the subject and the style, but not in terms of who is making the art. And I think that's something that we can still do better at today and be more radical about today.
I also would just say, because I studied theater, and Thérèse Raquin as a play in France in the 1800s was completely shocking because the main character was a prostitute. So it was happening in all the artistic genres in Europe, and seems like, as usual, slow to kind of drift over to at least expand representation in who was being represented. And then you see all the social movements expanding that continue today, of expanding who is able to do the representing. So I just wanted to add that, because I'm steeped in that history as well.
And I guess I should also say who is represented in institutions as being a maker, because there were people making art all along, but it's who gets recognized and held up within these systems that we have. So that's, I think, a qualifier I need to add to that.
I want to bring that back to something Debra was saying in terms of the field and sort of we've done this, because it seems like the other thing that radical artists or individuals do is they never quite let you slumber. Like, they remind you that the breadcrumbs are not enough, right? And it's pushing for institutional change to sort of bridge what you were saying, Nikki. So another question. One critic applauded the Ashcan artists for creating, quote unquote, a national art. Can you describe, from your own perspectives, what you think national art means and how the works you've chosen do or do not successfully encapsulate this statement? Nikki, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. So I think for me, a national art would be many different, all of the different people who are part of the nation should be able to express and make art that's meaningful to them, that is equally valued. I do not think Davies is necessarily doing that in his work. He's representing a very small subsection of society. And he's a little bit unusual within the Ashcan school because he's not interested in representing everyday people, and instead he's more interested in subjective experience. And so I think for him, he wanted to create a national art in that he was comparing the United States to Europe at the time. And a lot of people in the United States felt very insecure about the fact that they felt they didn't have an art tradition in the United States. So Davies was looking to Europe and trying to bring European art styles into the United States to create a national art style, but he was not representing the people living in the United States very well. So.
Thanks for bringing that context, Nikki, in terms of like this almost anxiety that the Ashcan schools seem to have about like, I don't know what our national art is, and let's turn to other sources to sort of define that on our own. So thank you. Debra, I saw you move your mic a little. Did you have a response?
Yeah, you know, and I thought about that question too, and I thought about, well, you know, what would have been considered national art at that time versus, you know, what national art today would be something completely different, because there is more, you know, we do have more artists of color, and we do have more acknowledgement of, you know, non-white people making art. But at that time, you know, and I think about, you know, the Sloan drawings of you know, the etchings of the tourists going out to the pueblos, you know, that to me is also, it's like, you know, as I said before, it's a celebration of, you know, America and Americanness of, you know, this Western expansion that like this is all ours, and you know, we have the right to, you know, like everything, and that includes, you know, having the right to defining what national art is and who is, you know, who those artists are. You know, it doesn't include, you know, non-white artists. So, you know, I question, you know, just. And I don't think they weren't thinking that then either in that time. You know, America at the time was, you know, this was at a time also where salvage anthropology was happening. So, you know, anthropologists and archaeologists were coming onto native lands and, you know, to our ancestral sites and digging up our ancestors and sending them to museums and universities. So, you know, we weren't considered human. We were, you know, we were less than. So there was no room for Native artists to be a part of national art or be considered a national artist. So, you know, those are the kinds of things that I think about, and I don't think they were thinking that at that time.
Debra, I think you've done two things for me. One is you've talked about how the definition of a national art could change over time, right, depending upon the nation, like we've seen here, and then who's part of the nation also can change over time, using the example of sort of salvage anthropology and the views on Native and Indigenous people as well, which there's something about this question that sort of feels like a trap too, because to create a national art, you then have to define what is national, and that means excluding certain people and bodies. So thank you for that. Anne.
Oh, I'm gonna build off of what Debra said about that, because I feel like at the time, and I'm you know, loose grasp of the historical context, so please chime in at any point, but I think we're really, as a young country still, trying to figure out what kind of a country we wanted to be. Europe at that time was setting in place social support systems. They had been representing a wider range of people from, you know, classes and cultural backgrounds, race and class, and much longer, and had established social support programs. At this time, there was the equivalent of Social Security in Europe, and we wouldn't have it for another 30 years at that point. So I think some of the representations were jolting us into asking, what kind of a country are we going to be? Is it going to be a place where we support those who don't have? Are we going to share that? Or is it going to be pure on just capitalism, marketplace? When bodies run out, they run out. We exploit the labor. That is one of the reasons why representations of age are so challenging to do respectfully in this country, because they fall out of the economic and productivity matrix. They don't have value in that system. They're depicted really only in a medical frame as using resources, not adding to them. So that's another reason why I'm like, yeah, she's about to say something. She has something of value. She has a purpose, and that's, to me, this is an exception to that. So going back, just to summarize, I think it's an exploration of what kind of country we want to be. So if it's a question, if a national art is a question about what this nation is going to be, then I think it's questioning that.
Thanks for that, Anne. You also made me think about what the national body looks like, and it's young, mobile, healthy, meaning that physically able and productive in terms of a capitalist sense. So thank you for that. My friends in the audience, we're gonna open it up to questions. So get your beautiful brains going. And before that, panelists, do you have any questions of each other or any points you wanted to come back to? Great. Audience, any questions? Yes, sir. Can I repeat the question for the recording? So it was for Debra to repeat the name of the native artist who has represented the Pueblo in ways that are different from Sloan and more rooted in sort of honoring, and then also of Anne, other representations of the elderly that are honorific and more human and humane.
Yeah, so the artist that I mentioned is Peblita Velarde, Velarde, and she's from Santa Clara, Pueblo.
And I have to really think, because my instinct is to say, now go and observe all the times when all you see are hands. Like in advertisements about older people, you don't actually see the older person, you just see a pair of hands, because people are too hesitant to actually portray the older full body itself. Or I even have a colleague who studied representations of aging where it's an older hand and they show a dog, but they don't actually show the older person. Those are analyzing a lot of advertising. So to look at that, but I'd have to give some more thought to representations of age, and that one of the things that's really beautiful about the arts and aging is that the arts are, of course, a symbolic and emotional language that operate both in the marketplace, but also in the gift economy. So you never have to retire from that. And so you can, older people now, particularly in the last couple decades, have really, there's been an expansion in community arts programs that are serving and particularly targeting and inviting older adults into representation, and so they can learn to become artists or to continue to expand their skills in representation all the way to the end of life. Whether that's people have full cognitive or physical capacity or not, it's accessible. So I'm dodging your question by naming specific artists, but also sort of elaborating on opportunities for older people to represent complexly late life as well.
I think a lot of the French naturalist and realist artists in the 1860s, 70s were doing representations of older people, but I think it's in a different way from the Sloan print, because they're thinking about, it's again kind of an othering perspective, because it's artists based in the city who are representing rural peasants in a way that they expect this rural life to disappear because of industrialization. So they're thinking about the hard labor of rural life and representing elderly people as people who are kind of downtrodden and they're tired and they're broken because they've worked so hard their whole lives. So I feel like that's different from what this is, but that's the first body of representations of elderly people that came to mind from an art historical perspective.
Thanks.
I'm going to go back and look at the wood gatherer through the paradigm and see what's positive and not positive.
And Anne, I'm going to push your dodge a little bit by asking you to talk about your work with TimeSlips and theater and play and sort of what I feel like you are producing through your organization and through sort of your research, new ways of engaging with, representing, and having elderly people represent themselves. And I wanted to know if you could talk about that a little bit and sort of the paradigm you're working with and the processes that you've worked within to really support new representations of the elderly.
Well, and some of it can expand as well, thank you for that, to really considering the work, inviting people into representation who, for myriad reasons, feel as though they've never been invited or they don't have the tools. So it's building creative confidence for people. My work started particularly with people with dementia, who when you say, would you like to make art or tell a story? Oh, I can't do that, I can't do that. And so it's a lot of coming back to, we just make it up. You don't have to, there's no right answer. We can truly make it up, and you shift the frame to imagination rather than memory, and the whole world opens up for expression. So my work is mostly on the interpersonal level in improvisation, but then also taking those tools of improvisation and putting them into systems. So an example of very slow change is a collaboration I did a couple of years ago with 12 rural nursing homes, all solidly Medicaid in rural Kentucky. And we worked with the staff, with a local artist as an artist in residence, to reimagine the story of Peter Pan from their own perspective, and infusing opportunities for creativity throughout every day, bringing in young people from schools to explore with them, local artists, really high-level artists that we brought in for residencies, in an attempt to really transform a place where mostly people go to wait to die into a cultural center where activities were so interesting that it changed people's perspective of what they're capable of inside and outside the care home. So it's really opening up possibility of representation and meaning making again all the way to the end of life. So, and that's very slow. It was a 2-year trajectory where I think we were talking about, you don't let the institution scab back over. It's micro changes where you stay in it and you're like, this is the long process. And you have to experience what it feels like to do things differently so you can't scab back over into the old pattern. So, yeah.
What I got from that process was, one, the notable quotable, moving towards imagination instead of memory, but also it's interesting to think about that 2-year process where really, I imagine that if you grew up in this Western society that sees elderly people as disposable and no longer like vital, that you really start to bury that within yourself and start to believe that image of yourself. And it seems like this process that you've created has allowed the people that you worked with to represent themselves to themselves and come to like shape their own narratives and create new narratives for themselves, which is really fills me with a lot of joy and heart.
Just a super quick example, at one of the nursing homes in Appalachia, very deep in Appalachia, many of the people who were participating in the performance were wards of the state. We didn't know this. We were just asking to get permission to be photographed, and they're like, the state won't give it to us. I was like, but this is such a positive thing. And they said, well, actually, we've never asked for permission to photograph. And I said, can you try? Because they're performing in something that can have ripple effects for, and they did, and it changed, just even asking or imbuing value in the representation of the photograph of their participation and honoring that, their work in the process, changed, their view, the way that the institution viewed them as well, so.
Thank you. And on the note of representation, process, and how institutions view individuals, Debra, can I shine a light on the Center for Native Futures for a second? This, can you please share with us what that is, the impetus behind it, and when it was founded?
Yeah, so, well, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say I love that phrase, scabbing over. I need to take that back with me when I go back to the Field Museum. Let's not scab over here.
It's a really visual phrase.
Yes,
it really works
it
very
is.
well.
I mean, I could see it. Like, I could see it happening. So, okay, yeah, okay. Anyway, so yes, Center for Native Futures. I am one of the co-founders of a newly formed Native arts organization in Chicago. It's actually based on a long-time dream that my husband and I had. So I met my husband at the Institute of American Indian Arts, brought him back home to Chicago with me, and we were embarking on our careers as artists, and we found that there were no opportunities. And at the time, it was kind of like that kind of intimidating, if you wanted to show in an art gallery, you had to go with a portfolio, and they were just very pretentious, and there was no space for Native artists. So it was very intimidating, especially for a Native person to walk into a white space and say, hey, show my art. So it's just something we didn't do. And so we knew that there needed to be more opportunities for Native artists, and unfortunately, we had to leave Chicago to find those opportunities. We had to go to places like Santa Fe, or my husband, he got his jump start in Indian markets. So the Santa Fe Indian Market, the Idle-Jorg Indian Market, Herd Indian Market, and so now he's represented at Blue Rain Gallery in Santa Fe. But still, we have no gallery representation in Chicago. We have no art spaces dedicated for Native artists where we can work with other Native artists and in proximity with each other. And we're tired of waiting around for the art museums in Chicago to ask us to be in their space. We created our own space. So Center for Native Futures, our long-term dream is for this to be an art center for Native artists where we can provide studios and have gallery spaces where we can curate our own shows, show our own art, bring in and nurture emerging Native curators, and just be a place where we can support and share our experiences as artists with young artists. So the pandemic was actually a time when we kind of regrouped with some friends. The Native art scene, or Native art artists are growing in Chicago, still very small, but we started to have a conversation, and we said, you know what, why don't we just do this? Let's just see what we can get done. And with the help of one of our very close friends, she helped us get our 501c3 status, and that was in toward the end of 2020. So we've signed our lease, and we're waiting to move into our space probably by the spring. But I think we're getting a lot of national attention. There are various Native art collectives that are also creating their own spaces, because we're just tired of waiting around. But I think in this way too, we have that agency to control, how we operate and what we do, and we can control our narrative.
Would you call the work radical?
Yes, absolutely. But I think I feel like it's a welcomed radicalness, because we have so much support. We have support from, major funders, and, just people are coming to us now. And, so even though we're not like fully established, we're still really new, people are aware of us now.
I asked that question tongue in cheek, so thanks for the laughter, because it is something that seems like it happened quickly, but in response to something that's been happening for a very long time. So thank you for that. Yes, in the back. Terrell. I'm going to try to summarize for the audio and to repeat the question. So summary is the audience member mentioned feeling similarly to Debra, as though they couldn't connect to any of the works of art on view because they didn't represent them either in terms of race, age, class, etc. And the audience member then also did research a little bit on the Ashcan and learned that many of the artists were from the same background, white, middle class, male. And the question then is, what is the line between radicalism and exploitation in art making? Is that accurate? As it relates to Ashcan. Okay. I acknowledge that none of us on this panel identify as Ashcan experts. Jump in if you want to. China, no pressure, no pressure. So in our own perspective, what is the line between radicalism and exploitation as it relates to Ashcan? But I might actually even broaden it beyond Ashcan. Anyone can jump in.
I think the audience member mentioned that exploitation isn't discussed as far as Ashcan goes, and I think it is today. It wasn't at the time, but I think people were not thinking about representing everyone accurately or as sensitively as they might, but I think today it is more of a question, like, is this representation or is it exploiting and othering people in order to benefit from seeming to be cutting edge or avant-garde? So I think that is more of a question in scholarship today, but it's a question that we need to think about with contemporary art too, like who is making these artworks, who are they representing, and how and to what ends? So I think that's a question that is still relevant, even more than ever, perhaps.
I would just echo what you're saying, and also just, we keep coming back to what was national, what was considered national art then, that these little micro steps that are easier for us to see in hindsight, that even the people who had access to becoming or being considered artists, like where was the bracket around art and collectible art or commercial art or marketable art, that was a very narrow frame, around who had access to that. And for that group of people, a very thin sliver of, the larger people who are capable of art or representation or who were making art and that we now see as art, for them to expand the subject of their art making. It's such a tiny radical thing in hindsight. And now we would say, of course, it's exploitation because the people who are, they're not benefiting in any way from the work. They probably, other than maybe Sloane's mother, right? Benefit, and maybe that's why he, drew her the way he did. They're not benefiting from the work in any way. Now it would be co-created, it would be cited, it would be, our framing now would be very, very different, I hope. Maybe not from, the struggles that we continue to have, but the steps are clearer now, at least, that have to get made.
I'm still processing that because, I think those images that were created at that time by mostly white men, and I think if you, want to go back to that question of what is national art, it's also, at that time, it was that celebration of, colonial settlerism, right? And so now we're identifying it as that today, and, those are the steps we're taking toward decolonization is, like looking at those more, closely. And, it is exploitation because it's that sense of, like who gets the right to. Who gets the right to paint? Who gets the right to make art? Who gets the right to show their art? Who gets the right to decide what they want to paint? And we didn't. I mean, I think we had those rights, but not in the same way that they did. And so, but yeah, at that time, no, they're not. I don't think they're looking at it as exploitation, but it is. But there definitely is that kind of, I think they are thinking about, well, I get to paint this, so that's what I'm going to do. And if, I get to decide what this person's going to look like. There's today though, and I just said this earlier today in another interview that I did, there's a saying now that's going around in Indian country among Native people, nothing about us without us. So, we make our own art, and when we make our art, we make it about ourselves. We make it, based on our lived experiences and who we are as Native people. And I don't think that, I do get upset because I still see non-Native artists making art with Native themes or, painting or drawing Native people. And that should not be anymore. I don't think that they don't have that right anymore because we are still here. And I think at this time too, there was that kind of thinking that Native people weren't going to exist anymore. So we're going to depict them because we see them right now and they're no longer going to be, and they're no longer going to be this romanticized version that I see them as. And I think that's also the same, mentality that they were using in painting or depicting other people as well.
I feel like, and this isn't a final answer, but these are some of the nuggets that we've gathered from your answers that you can sort of guesstimate that it's exploitation if you can ask the question of who gets the right to nuance, and it's not the subject that is represented. Who benefits from the work, and you mentioned that, and Nikki, and if it's not the subject of the work, and also the framing device that you've offered us from Native peoples, and that we've heard at the Milwaukee Art Museum from our Native Advisory Group as well, nothing about us without us. So if the people who are being depicted are left out of the conversation of their own representation, then there is a 100% chance that it is an exploitative process. So does that feel like a fair summary?
Yeah, and then I wanted to say too, because when you were talking about, elderly being able to represent themselves, I mean, it applies to that too. Nothing about us without us. I mean, something can only be depicted or represented well when it's done and, from that place of knowing and that lived experience.
I hold great hope for co-creation and collaboration, but I feel like it's a step beyond. It only comes out of trust, and in many situations there isn't the trust to do that yet. And so I think it can happen, and I have seen work that's collaborative and cross race, cross age, cross ability, and just to give the disability movement Nothing About Us Without Us its own due as well from the 70s, that it's possible to get to that place, but it's going to take it's durational radicalism to get there.
I'm not trying to plug the gallery tour on November 10th. I'm really not. But this idea of co-creation is really interesting because if you walk through the exhibition, there are a few pieces where the individuals who are documented look like they're withholding. Like, they don't look like Sloane's mother. They look like they do not trust the artist who is representing them. There's a limit to what you see. It is almost as though you will capture the outside of me, but you won't capture me, like the capital M me, which is quite interesting when you think about the language of co-creation and the relationship between the sitter and the artist, and these moments where I feel like you can see that tension at play, the tension between the sitter who's like, I don't know how this feels. But that made me think about your question a little bit about this line between exploitation and radicalism and the agency that some of the sitters, I feel like you can witness them in the show as well. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I was curious. Oh, sorry.
No, I'm not. 1, 2. Sorry. Sure.
There's one, I don't know, Debra, how much research you did into, this is slow, too.
Mm-hmm.
There's one thing about this that keeps sticking with me, which I'm curious about, which is the way the buses are positioned. And it makes me feel like there was this kind of intentional effort to try to show the leering outsiders. And so I guess I was curious, maybe it's a question for China, I don't know, whether Sloane does talk at all about
So the question is whether or not there's any chance that Sloan is trying to depict colonialism and intentionality behind this work. Debra, you can answer if you want to, but I'm also going to throw some knowledge that I learned while on the tour.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, it's 12 p.m. on November 10th.
I was going to say, yeah, I think this is something that China can answer, but I did, so I saw this piece for the first time, right before this discussion. I was up there and I read the label for this, and it was interesting to me to learn that Sloan was even just like kind of, mocking and caricaturing the tourists. So, he's and so then he's got like this even further disconnect from, like the Pueblo dancers and the ceremony that's happening, because he's also just kind of disconnected from the tourists as well and just kind of making fun of them, just kind of showing like the gluttony of tourists and tourism. So that's what I got from that.
You don't necessarily need the tour. A really good object label will also get you the information that you need. So yes, that's what I was going to say. And I think that a question that I had then was, does the satire work, like without context, like what's the tension there? So that was my concern. Like I know that he's trying to poke fun at the tourists, but while looking at it, I kept wondering, is he successful, right? Like, or is this something that's lost over time?
I think if you think about who the audience is, then who he is making this for, maybe it is successful in that. Maybe they see that, right? But, for me as a Native person, as a Pueblo person who can identify more closely with with the dancers, I'm just seeing a whole completely different thing.
Thank you.
I think the titles help to point out the satire a little bit, because it's the mention of detour as points to the tourism inherent in the scene and kind of making fun of the tourists, I think. And Sloan very intentionally writes the titles of the works underneath them, which is not always the case. So I think that goes a little ways towards pointing out the satire, but it is definitely something that can get easily lost over time and even in his own time, I think.
Well, just going back to your response to it, if it feels like the exterior is the satire, but the interior, if you don't connect to it, if the intentionality and the earnestness of like really taking the time to depict it with more detail and realism than the way he's depicting the outside, because he kind of takes the same sweep for both, the satire doesn't quite work because the exterior and the interior are just kind of treated the same.
Gentleman in the back.
Dr. Debra, thank you so much for making me see the pictures in a completely different way. Because when I visited the exhibit, I just saw the technique. And I was in awe seeing that these pictures are made in metal, scratched from metal, and then some of them are no bigger than my hand. And I was like, how did he do that? Oh my God, this is fantastic. Me being not from this country, not born in this country, I did not see your point of view of they're making fun of my people. And I'm sorry you feel that way. And I didn't see the old people, because as you can see, I'm not 20 years old. I work in a factory, and with me, there is a 78-year-old Mexican guy who runs circles around me, and I'm very proud to say that I'm running circles around the 30-year-old guys. I don't feel well at all. And the view of the people who are not American but are depicted in America, that they're British or they are European, that's a very fresh view to me. So my question is, how did you see the spirit of the picture where I only see the technique?
There was like so much magic in that. So one, thank you to the panelists for helping this audience members see the works of art differently. And that leads to the question, and to see the stories and the impact of the works of art in particular. And that leads to the question of, how do you get to the spirit of the work instead of just the technique? And that feels like such a looking question and so personal to each person. So maybe I'll start with all of you and sort of your entry points. Like, what draws you to looking?
I can start because I'm the art person, but I think it's different for every work. Sometimes I am more drawn to the technique. So I was traveling in New York over the weekend, and I saw a print that had like the best use of dry point I've ever seen in a work of art, and I gravitated towards it because of that rather than subject matter. So I definitely do still look at things from a technique first perspective at times. And printmaking is just magical, so I'm glad that you were drawn to the idea of making prints. But other times, I think because I look at prints all the time, I can more easily background the technique and focus more on what is being represented. So I think for me, sometimes it's a question of how much I'm looking at similar techniques. But then every once in a while, something will stand out in its own way.
Do you want to go? I can go. I mean, my entire 30-year career is about inspiring wonderment. So I think I tend to, that tends to be my frame, is looking at something with a curiosity and the tools of an artist to ask questions about, what does this look like upside down? What if it was a different scale? What if it was in a different color? And then you see the color and you see things differently, like you're asking what ifs and imagining things differently in what you see. And I think that's kind of my art form, is doing that and inviting people into that mind frame. So that's what I do.
Yeah, I actually do look at technique, and I admire skill. Sometimes I worry when I go into an art museum and I get really close to an art piece because I don't want to get yelled by the security guard, because I'm looking at brushstrokes. I love looking at brushstrokes, and I love getting really close and trying to figure out how they did that. Is that something that I could do? And so I love that, but I'm also drawn to narrative, because there could be a very awful painting with an awful narrative, and that's going to be something I'm not even going to be drawn to, even if it's so skillfully done. I'm not going to go up to it and look at it. So narrative to me is really important, and because I'm a Native artist, my husband's a Native artist, our daughter's a performing artist, I'm surrounded by Native art. That's what I really, really love. So I just that, when I see Native art, that really draws me in, because I can relate to it. I can share the experience because I have a similar experience. So for me, it's experience too, and how that grasps me. But then I do look at technique also. But at the same time, I try not to get so hung up on it, because then sometimes I feel like for people that are self-taught, looking at only technique and skill can be a barrier too, and then you miss the story or the narrative that they're trying to share, because you're more worried about that's just, that person wasn't rendered well, or that hand wasn't rendered well. But then you're overlooking that story. So I think for me, that's why story is more important.
I feel like there was overlap in your answers, but there were also 3 unique offerings. So technique, wonder, and story and narrative, and I feel like all 3 are okay. And as someone who came to museums, but I didn't grow up going to museums and my parents are migrants and not native to this country, I feel like a lot of the work that I try to do is try to encourage people and remind people that they have everything that they need to look at a work of art, and there's no wrong way to sort of step into it, as we've seen. And sir, I feel like your question was also tied to like, how do I come to know more a little bit about it? And that is a really exciting question about what attracts you to the work might be the thing that lends you into sort of navigating and diving deeper into it, which I think is the goal of looking. And if I could offer that, for me, wonder, I walk the galleries quite often, and I think it's easy a little bit to get, I love the collection, and sometimes it's easy for me to ignore it because I'm around it so often. But when I walk through it with our toddler, who's 4, she points me to things that I have never looked at before and asks me questions that I've never considered before, and she has been my best teacher. I won't let you borrow her, but I will. I do think that wonder that she has is something that I want to hold on to, so that I can be the teacher who she inspires me to be. I think we have time for, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, I don't usually do this, but I've been doing Instagram posts that are all invitations to my father has been caregiving for my mother. And so I take a photograph of something in the day that you would walk by. And then it's just a little invitation to wonder and to see a little differently. And I've been doing it for over a year now. So, and it's actually, I'm collaborating with a printmaker on my first art exhibit to turn those into an experience that'll be in print. So, yeah, you might look at that. It's just AD Basting.
Any final questions? Honestly, that felt like the perfect note to end on, this question on wonder and merriment. And it made me think about this attention to the everyday and these items that you might ignore. I feel like that's another prompt for entering the museum. Like you could come in with a different question, like what's a work of art that like inspires excitement in me, right? Or what's a work of art that really allows me to mourn and sit with it and grieve? Like the idea that there's an endless set of possibilities for the works of art you can see and connect with at any given moment. And that teaches to see anew, I think, is what your prompt made me think about. So if we could take a moment, please, to just put our hands together and thank our amazing panelists for their time. And thank you all for coming. I truly appreciated your vulnerability, your offerings, your willingness to just engage in this conversation, and thank you. It's been a real joy. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next time.